Hello everyone and welcome to the Third Age Babylon 5 podcast. As many of you know already, usually we are three friends from Europe who were much too young to watch the show when it first came out. Today it's only two of us, but that doesn't mean that Meike abandoned us completely. She left us some notes and she will be with us soon again. Alright, what's the title? I forgot the title. You have to help me with the title.
The title is, once again, very poetic, And the Sky Full of Stars.
That's right. And that's an episode where the main plot is a very unique attack on Sinclair, I would say, where he is captured by humans from Earth who put him into a simulation to find out what happened to him at the Battle of the Line. So that's a good summary, right?
Yes.
What's the B plot? I forgot about the B.
There isn't really a big B-plot. We do get a lot of interaction between Delenn and Franklin, where we learn also things that pertain to the Battle of the Line, so it's all connected in that regard.
Right. So, first impressions.
Yeah.
Usually I sometimes, as I watch the show for the second time, mostly all of it, some episodes I've watched more often, but it's almost, for all of it, it's the second time. So usually I can tell that apart, but this episode has always the same effect on me. I think it's very interesting. It's always like the moment where I really get an idea of why Babylon 5 is so interesting and so greatly written. So here it's really where I feel we have everything. We have a big mystery that is totally catching, and we get an idea of what's so dramatic and inspiring about this whole world. And so I really always enjoy that episode a lot.
Yeah, and for me it's much the same. This feels, veterans of the show are always talking about when is the point where the show really starts to go. And this is one of these points for me where I feel like some of the simmering mysteries are already getting some good hints at conclusions. Like we are making tangible progress on Sinclair's hole in the mind. And at the same time, it's opening up so many more questions, both in terms of the world building and the actual plot that's moving forward. So this is really great for me. And yeah, Meike's first impressions, which we are always most interested in because she's the newbie, this time were a little bit tainted because she accidentally started watching the show in the German dubbing, because all the streaming services always want to default on your region. And so she was caught in that. And she had two observations from that. One, that the original episode title in the German dub gives the entire plot away because it's something to the effect of caught in the cyberweb. So kind of the entire premise is out there. And because the dubbing is for all the main voices, but also a lot of the background noise, she actually noticed that at least in the German version, there is a bit of talk in the background where a station announcement is made that staff from the Centauri embassy is called in to deal with the Ragesh 3 situation. So even the dub in the background continues this little plot thread that the diplomatic incident of Ragesh 3 from the beginning of the seasons is continuing on. So she was just taking note of that as painful as it is with the episode titles, the dubbing is somewhat interesting, that it actually takes into account these little world-building details, and sometimes they just jump out at you a little bit more. All right, with only one big plot in this episode that we are most concerned with, our entire main discussion is going to be maybe a little bit more streamlined, and a lot of the notes that Meike gave us are concerning the newspaper that Mr. Garibaldi is reading very early on. So we are going to continue with some of these a little bit as they pertain to the main plot of this episode. But maybe let's start with the main plot and start with the two knights that are coming aboard the station. They don't have names, they are just listed as Knight 1 and 2 in the episode.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering why I called them knights, because they don't, yeah, okay. Yes, always when I have this hologram of Sinclair, when I open that up, I kind of feel like, couldn't you just identify the commander without that? It's a bit...
It seems like if you know which station you want to go to, this should be obvious that you're on the right track.
Yeah, but in general, I think those are interesting characters. I think the one of them who is in the cyberweb together with Sinclair is just a great actor. I think he really, maybe he's not the most authentic TV actor, because I always think of really good theater acting when I watch him, but it's a lot of fun because when you have this evil terrorist kind of guy, I really enjoy how he plays it, although it's maybe not the most common on TV to see it like that.
And I think this is very fitting that Babylon 5 has a lot of guest actors that have this stage background, and I think especially in science fiction, this is something that you see more often than perhaps in the rest of TV. And also the entire way that the show was produced and the way that the sets were built was very much based on theater craft, because it was very good at working with a budget. So it's nice to see these actors that then really get to toy around this, and especially also the way that this character is presented in the cyberweb later on. It has a lot of this like very more symbolical, less literal stagecraft going on there. So this is very nice. And yeah, I keep referring to them as knights, even though we don't ever hear this name in the episode itself. It's only in the credits, but it's always stuck with me because I have this weird fixed idea in my head that the larger organization is maybe very chess themed. So you have these two knights that go out into the field, and their handler somewhere would be called the queen or something like that. Just something about it stuck out for me for this like weird secret agent stuff that they're going on, that they have these kinds of code names. And yeah, Meike also pointed out in the newspaper, the Universe Today that we see, we get some references to things that have happened recently. For example, the headline that Home Guard leader Lester was found guilty in an attack on a Minbari embassy and got convicted. So we still have this echoing of the previous pro-Earth group and terrorism group that was planning like mass assassinations that we were talking just very recently about. And now we get these two guys. And as we talk about the two knights first, I'm interested how you feel, how they contrast with the pro-Earth group that we've seen so far, because they seem to be, at least to me, they always seem to be a different branch, a different kind of organization that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever really emphasized their differences in my head so far, because yes, they operate very differently, but they definitely would agree on a lot of things. So what we have here maybe is that these pro-Earth movements would be more like modern Nazis, like really like okay, to make my point, I have to make another point.
Sure.
Because when I see this episode, I always watch it really directly as a metaphor for Europe, maybe even Germany in the interwar period, where these things really actually happened in other ways, of course, but where that was a motivation, a kind of crime that was very common at that time. So I would say that what we have here now is probably someone who was in a movement that was more old-fashioned, more traditional, more conservative, more like really wanting the monarchy back, while the other ones were more like the kind of Nazis that were more modern, more looking forward, but they agree on a lot of things.
Yes.
So I would definitely say that these are two different groups, but they would definitely work together very well.
I think so, or at least I feel like they would sort of thrust Earth Alliance in a similar direction. Another note that Meike gave us is that this episode also has a reference to the Earth election that we saw a little bit earlier. An interesting connection where there's a headline about Psychor potentially endorsing the vice president that Santiago ran with. So we have on the one hand this reference to, Psychor is really getting into Earth politics, but if you remember, Santiago won on this basis of protecting Earth cultures, and this seems very much like this thing where Home Guard and these two knight dudes both probably want Santiago in office, both probably agree with this general premise of, we want to protect Earth cultures, but then in the way that they sort of present their ideology and the way they operate, like you say, it's still very different. And I found that very interesting, that Babylon 5 shows us, even if there is, broadly speaking, this pro-Earth movement on the rise, this isn't saying that there is one consensus among all humans what this looks like. There's just this collection of different groups, and this is something that we see in, populist examples nowadays, that this is always, sure, one big camp that exists somewhere and identifies as conservative or whatever you want to call it, But then within that are all these little subgroups that are always infighting, but sometimes also joining forces wherever it's possible. And this is like the more extreme the views get, no matter where on the political spectrum, I think this is something that you always see, these sort of little camps. Let's talk a little bit about the Knights' modus operandi, how they go about their entire business. They have their weird hologram to identify they're in the right place. But then what they do is they take advantage of security flaws that exist. We have the security guard Benson, who is a gambling addict, and they use this to their advantage to get on board of the station, get a power source smuggled in, and then they assemble their weird little technology, which I hope we get to talk about later on a little bit, because I really like the piece of technology that they're using and how it relates to their entire little conspiracy theory. But yeah, they get themselves some quarters, they set up a base of operations. They are much more professional, I would say, than what we saw from Home Guard previously. These guys seem like they have an organization, a hierarchy and such set up, and then they manage to kidnap actually the commander, which is a whole different thing. How they manage that and how long it takes the rest of the command staff to notice that Sinclair is currently not answering his pager.
That was what I found the most concerning, that it took so long, that you can actually be so important, really like the commander of the station, where I think there could be some security that nothing happens to you, because you of course always have some enemies when you are in such a position. And after 12 hours, I think Ivanova noticed that he didn't come back from his night rest.
Yeah.
Therefore, then I found the most concerning.
Yeah, it's concerning, but I think it also speaks to the way that we think about this station, where it's obviously a place where you don't have 24 surveillance by internal sensors of all life signs on board, like you would expect maybe in another more advanced setting. And it's a big place, so the commander being outside of it, maybe especially Sinclair, who has this tendency to take matters into his own hands, this doesn't immediately ring all the alarm bells. So yeah, maybe something that security should tighten up on. Maybe this is going to be a wake-up call for Garibaldi. Although, to be fair, once they notice that something went wrong, they are very quick to act on it, and Garibaldi doesn't much hesitate to get involved in there. But all of this is sort of happening behind the scenes. What for us is the more important thing: as soon as he is kidnapped, Sinclair gets strapped into this big chair, gets a mind interface, and is transported into this weird, and at first we don't even know what it is, this weird parallel version of Babylon 5.
Yes, this waking up of Sinclair, I have to admit, is always like my biggest nightmare. When I haven't slept well, or when there was an important appointment. As for example, when I had exams that were very, very, very important. I sometimes had this nightmare of I'm waking up and I try to switch on the light, but the light doesn't work. And then a lot of really surreal, chaotic things happen within like 2 seconds until I'm really awake. And that's always, for me, a sign of I haven't slept enough and something is very stressful. And it can really make me completely paranoid. So I really find this waking up on this dead space station very, very intense. And I don't know, having to act through that would actually have an impact on me mentally. A very, very big one.
I mean, just even to imagine this big sound stage that always is like busy with crew and something, and then, the lighting is darkened out and there is nothing to see there. It's a very profound effect. And I completely agree, even though this is a relatively short sequence, this is the part of the episode that I always think first of when I hear about it. And it is also something that is very striking in the show overall. This one moment where you get to see the station in this completely dead state, because this is something that we usually never get to see. The station usually doesn't really have a night cycle where everything really calms down. Even then, there's people around, there's nightlife going on. And for me, it really makes me appreciate just how much work is put into making all of these sets very alive, with dozens and dozens of extras and all the little stands, all the little props that are usually there to fill up these big spaces. And this is the first time, and I think it shows a lot of confidence on the side of the set crew as well, to really show just the bare walls of these sets and give us this impression of, oh, this is a really big, really empty space. And I think, the waking up part is bad, but for me it's also when he goes into the CNC, and then there's this realization, oh no, I'm not just alone on the station, something is fundamentally wrong with the universe. Like I look outside and there is no ships, nothing, there's no comms channels. It's just this completely dead thing. It always reminds me of the TNG episode where there's literally this failing of reality, where reality sort of shrinks in around Crusher as she's alone on the Enterprise and everybody else just keeps disappearing. It feels like a condensed version of that, where the universe itself is somehow collapsing.
I don't know, I never had that association actually, because it was never that we saw that he looked outside and realized, ooh, the stars are gone. It was really just
that would be worse.
Yeah, and it was really just that he looked outside and was like, oh, everyone else is gone and I'm trapped alone on a dead space station. And that is just a much more, realistic and less
high concept, maybe.
Yeah, so there's really like, okay, in a really, really completely fucked up version of still this reality, this could happen. Yeah, so that's what makes it so scary, actually.
Yeah, it's very different ways of horror that these two different scenarios would evoke. Yeah. But yeah, it is very strong, and eventually he kind of gets herded by our knight into the main corridor, where he's then, I guess, interrogated is a good term, even though I find it very interesting that from the beginning the knight is very much not just using this as a way to straightforward extract information, but he's using the entire scenario as an interrogation tactic to induce this fear, to induce this anxiety, and to really hammer home this point. He's very straight up forward with it as well. Like, you are in a simulation, this isn't real, and it doesn't really take away from the effect of the scenario, because the isolation is still very real.
Yes. And he also comes straight forward with his main question right in the first scene where they are together in, right?
Yes.
He immediately asks him what he wants to know. What happened in these 24 hours when you were out of contact? What did she see? And I mean, we already discussed it, I think, when we discussed the pilot.
Mm-hmm.
But here it becomes more clear that we have our own space and Babylon 5 version of the stab in the back legend. That's the English word. Dolchstoßlegende, wonderful word in German, which is something I learned in school the very first time I was introduced to the interwar period. That there was this myth that Germany could have won the war, but the Social Democrats and the Communists and whoever just fell into their back. And of course, if you looked at it militarily, it was stupid. We would have never won that war. And that was used by conservatives, by people that missed the monarchy, and as well by the Nazis for a lot of propaganda. And so we see that alive here, that we have humans who really believe we could have won against the Minbari, and capture Sinclair to find out whatever they can find out about this defeat that they have never really understood.
Yeah, I think this is for me also the strongest historical parallel, and the thing that strikes me always about the Dolchstoßlegende, this stab in the back, is that it almost feels like retroactively for like modern iterations of this narration, it almost has gotten stronger, because in World War II you have this very decisive defeat where, you know, you have this last stand in the capital. So it's very, very, I'm not going to say nobody can deny this, but it's very, very hard to deny that Germany lost the Second World War. And now retroactively, in comparison, World War I almost seems like, well, you know, the front line didn't collapse entirely until Berlin, so maybe there is more to that. And I feel like from the modern perspective, it's always gotten this like second wind where people are much more ready to accept this. Well, maybe there's something to it, because it wasn't that bad militarily, was it? Even though, well, you know, from the Central Powers, everything else had completely collapsed and there wasn't really much progress to be made. But yeah, and it goes into this thing, but with the big caveat that in this Babylon 5 universe, there is a much bigger question about how the Minbari War ended, a question that we have already been introduced to.
That it is not clear why they surrendered, of course, but I was also thinking that the idea here is that someone like Sinclair has collaborated with them, has fallen into the backs of the humans, and finding that, being able to prove that something like that happened would make it much more easier to accept a defeat. So that's also like a logical reasoning behind that. That's like, that would make it a lot easier to find someone whose fault it is, to find the evil one who, betrayed them.
I think that is completely right, and it shows us, I think, once again, also the difference between the two knights and something that we see in Home Guard. Because, we already talked a little bit when it came to Home Guard about how a lot of humanity doesn't really interact with aliens, and most of humanity probably never even leaves Earth, never really goes into space. And so it's easy to imagine how an ideology like Home Guards, where humanity is first, could take hold in this kind of situation. And now just add on top of that, if people don't really deal with aliens much, how many people really understand what the Minbari War was and how it turned out? And you look even at modern conflicts. Just today or yesterday, there was a headline in our news where there was a big investigation going about a missile has struck somewhere, and it takes experts in an ongoing conflict weeks of investigation to figure out who exactly fired that, with all the satellite data, with all GPS tracking and all the internet information sharing that we have nowadays. So amplify that into a war that takes place in orbit, and it's easy to imagine how people have just a very rough idea of what happened on that day. And ostensibly, if you ask the average human on Earth, well, we were at war with the Minbari, and at some point Earth amassed the biggest fleet in all of history in Earth's orbit, and the Minbari came, and there was a lot of fighting, a lot of big explosions, and then the Minbari surrendered. So the average Joe is probably going to think, okay, so that means we won, right? Like we like, how else are you going to explain that? And I feel like this isn't precisely announced in the show, but I feel like this is also where a lot of Home Guard ideology would end, where they would say, at that point we completely won, we fair and square beat the Minbari, and anything else that is told about us, about their technological superiority, that's all just propaganda, that's all just corrupt government, blah blah blah. So in a way, the Knights are taking a step further and actually acknowledging the fact of, oh no, we shouldn't have won that. It's weird that the Minbari actually capitulated, and this is where they start digging, and this is where they start imagining that there must be some kind of treason going on there. And if we are making historical references, very topical, it's not that long that we watched Oppenheimer, a big part of the conspiracy that the Knights came up with is this idea that the Minbari couldn't actually invade Earth. They couldn't do it. Like, maybe they beat us in space, but, space battles are one thing, their spaceships are very powerful, but on the ground, humans even fighting with sticks and stones, there's like 8 billion of us on this planet, they could have never made this invasion work. And this is a narrative that is very similar to what you see with justifications for the nuclear bombs, where there's this idea that, okay, fighting the Pacific War island to island, that is one thing, colony to colony, but it would have been so much worse having to actually do the main invasion, which I just like making this parallel, because the Knights kind of make this out as this, if only you hadn't struck the deal with the aliens, they would have lost this war. But then you look at real history, and no, this was probably just a good reason why the Minbari probably would have just bombarded the planet from orbit and not bothered with the actual invasion.
Yeah, that was actually what they were going for.
So, for me, this is very interesting, because in direct comparison to Home Guard, I don't want to say that the Knights are sympathetic, because they are still terrorists kidnapping people and putting them into weird mind prisons. But if I take a step back and just compare the two ideologies or the thought process behind Home Guard, which is mostly just, I don't like aliens because they take our jobs away, and then you have these guys that say, hey, there's this official narrative of how the Minbari War went, and it just doesn't add up, it's more relatable. It's something that I could easily see, obviously I can't fault them for kidnapping Sinclair, but if the average Joe on planet Earth says, well, I don't know, the government probably did something shady to make this war end, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. All I can really say is, that I can understand how we would get this thought process, and this is ultimately what Sinclair also does in this interrogation, where he is obviously opposed to the narrative that he's being fed. He obviously knows that this isn't exactly what happened. There wasn't this big conspiracy. but he also doesn't really have a much better answer to give. He knows from own experience that the defeat was real. This is where the episode title comes from, A Sky Full of Stars, and as in exploding Earth spaceships, they stood no chance and wouldn't have stood any chance in the invasion. But when it comes to actually explaining what happens, all he can come up with is, yep, maybe God changed his mind, maybe the universe blinked, maybe something weird happened, and ultimately anything that would happen would be at least as outlandish as the conspiracy theory that the Knights came up with.
Yes. I'm just thinking that I don't think that any of this is a real historical reference. I think that the story really starts going its own way, which is also good and important that it does that, and that it doesn't just tell us a tale, a fable to teach us something about history, which in some cases it does, but then it also spins its own new stories. And yes, we have been living with this mystery in the first few episodes that there's something up with the Minbari and with Sinclair. And here, I think, as someone at least watching it for the first time, you realize there's really more to it. There's really something going on. And you could start doubting everything that you know so far. You could really also catch yourself wondering which crazy conspiracy theory might have a true core, because you really don't know anything anymore. In the end, we even see Jalen with this other Minbari, I forgot his name.
He's another council member.
Yeah, he's a council member who really gives her the instruction if he ever finds out he has to die, which is like super, super serious and tough, and really shows us there's this big thing that we have no idea what it means.
And it's also this thing where you can see whatever truth will be revealed in the end is going to be as crazy as whatever Knights came up with, because already you have to explain, okay, so the part where the Minbari kidnap a random Earth pilot is actually true, and actually the ambassador to Earth on Babylon 5 is a member of the Grey Council, their secret government organization, and she has another one of those in her closet, and they plan assassinations if their secret gets really like... This is already so crazy. If you would try to convince anybody on this evidence alone that the Knights are wrong, that's probably not going to work. Like, this is a crazy story, but the pieces are falling together. Like the two dots that we can connect so far is it now starts making sense why Sinclair has this missing link in his head, and why Delenn would be a Satai, a member of the Grey Council on Babylon 5, because if these two things have something to do with each other, it would make sense that somebody of the Minbari in a very high position would be here to observe and to continue messing with him after the fact.
Yeah, because we don't know yet still why they investigated him in the first place. Yeah. Why did they let him on his ship? Why did they not just shoot him down? We also don't know what this investigation means that they did to him, and we don't know what they found out.
Yeah.
What the kind of thing is that they know now. They changed everything. So yeah, there's just this big mystery right now at the moment.
And notably at this point, humanity as a whole, and also we as viewers, don't really know what it could be with the Minbari, what could make the Minbari turn on a heel. We know they are very religious. We know Delenn is part of the religious caste, but what part of this religion could relate to humans, we have no idea. So this is still this big mystery. And obviously also a line of thought that nobody would really pursue. This is not like part of the reason why the Knights are in the end so off in their conspiracy theory is because they are talking always in this, typically for conspiracy theory, only in terms of power plays, like who would benefit from what and what would, be the interest of all these big groups in terms of political power. And this is ultimately not something that takes into account the fact that the Minbari are an alien culture that has very different priorities in certain regards.
I don't have a direct connection here, or I don't know for which that was a metaphor or something, but I really liked the fact actually that what is actually so far going on behind the scenes is so crazy that these conspiracy theories can um, um, take a profit out of what is really going on. Like, just the fact that here what is happening in reality is actually something the conspiracy theories can benefit from, because it is such a big mess and so wild. And I really like that, because I think you have that a lot, that you have really like a fact that is just so wild that it just gets twisted everywhere.
I mean, even if we take away the complexity of it, the simple answer that we can give, and which is the answer that Sinclair has to live with, is we don't know. The Minbari turned around, and this is what this interrogation always comes back to. The knight keeps asking why, and Sinclair doesn't have the answer. The only difference between them is Sinclair has had to learn to live with the fact that this is just something that he's not going to know.
Yes.
Which for him is especially bad, because he is friends with the ambassador to Minbar. And he knows that he cannot ask her this question again and again and again, because she will not give him an answer. Maybe can't give him an answer to this. And I think this speaks a little bit also to Sinclair's unique position. He alludes to the fact that he lived through the Battle of the Line. So for him, it was never an option not to find any kind of closure with that. If he can't do this, if he can't find any closure also with the death that he was surrounded by as somebody who was a pilot at the time, he could just simply not function. So he had to confront this trauma very directly. And I feel like what the Knights are representing is the whole rest of the planet that was completely helpless just watching the Battle of the Line, and never had this trauma made concrete enough to be forced to find any kind of conclusion with that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a soldier who, even before the Battle of the Line, was more or less trained and prepared. And I mean, that doesn't mean that soldiers don't get traumatized in ways that they can't deal with. But here we have someone who is competent to deal with that situation, and you have the rest of the population who deals with it differently. And yes, it's not in a position of power, cannot actively intervene, cannot really do something in these conflicts. That is definitely also a point. But what I also always felt when he was asked why in this repeated way, was that there was another kind of fear in this question, because the thought that the Knights had definitely was that Sinclair could have just sold his own race, he could have given information away, and for them it's not clear if they are ever really safe from the Minbari or from aliens. Maybe there could be a bigger plan, so the big disaster, the big genocide on humans, or even something worse, whatever, could still happen. And that is also a kind of a fear or worry that they try to find out of what are you going to do to us next? Have you sold us to the Minbari, and how?
Yeah.
Which is I find it interesting to see here how skeptical they are towards another human, another one of their own kind, and how much they fear the connection he has to this other race.
Very much so, especially because it's not only a human that they're being skeptical of, it's a war hero. It's one of the people who were actually fighting on the lines, probably the very last person that you would accuse of collaborating with the enemy that he was literally shooting at the time, unless you find a way to reconcile that. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Knight also gives Sinclair the out of saying, hey, maybe you collaborated with them because you were forced to do this and then they erased your mind. Like, maybe you literally do not know about this because they were messing with your mind. And this is the part which I find actually quite ingenious, that the Knights accuse Sinclair of having been tampered with while he is trapped in a machine to extract his memories and alter his perception of reality. So it makes sense to me, whoever these two Knights are, we don't get any background on them, but they are obviously people that work with this kind of technology. So of course these kinds of people would look at this technology that Earth has right now and think to themselves, hey, if we can do this, then obviously the Minbari could do it better.
Yes, and it also often is when you accuse someone else of doing something very, very, very bad, or very weird, or very questionable, that it's something that you yourself are capable of.
Yeah.
Actually kind of classic.
It has this like wonderful mirroring effect, but it makes the entire story of theirs, of course, also more plausible to us as the viewer, where we can see, well, it's probably not what happened, but it doesn't seem to be impossible. We know telepaths exist, and we know this kind of technology exists now. So,
and it's also something that I think I can say that now because Meike is not in the video, or will she watch it later?
Probably not, no.
It's also something that the Nazis on Earth, that the far right on Earth use later with it. It's not the Stockholm syndrome in here. It's they call it differently. Basically, this narrative of you have just been manipulated. They have just been messing with your mind. You don't like all of these alien influences. You're just confused. You're just mentally ill.
Yes. I mean, this is definitely something that we see foreshadowed here, that this is one of the tactics that is going to be more influential. It also kind of gives us a hint in the end which of these different pro-Earth groups is going to come out on top. And it isn't going to be the blunt force home guards approach that is the bluntest of the tools in the shed in that regard. It's going to be these people that have, a much more also relatable approach to things, which is much more tempting to get involved with.
Last episode that we recorded, I think I talked about my friend who went over to the far right people. I have to mention that when I moved into this region of Germany, actually when I moved to Bochum, which is a very grey, modern built city, not one of the pretty old ones. And at some point I started liking the city because I was studying there, because I had friends there, because I had the bars that I like to go to, and it had an own flair, it had an own atmosphere, even though it was kind of ugly. And we were still in touch at that point sometimes, and he told me that I had Stockholm syndrome because I could not like the city. I could not find something beautiful. I could not enjoy these bars. I was just confused, manipulated, crazy, you might say. So he also used that on me, I want to say. So it's I find that interesting.
And I mean, it fits this entire mindset that is extremely static, right? Like, it's basically the same thing that the one thing that the Knights don't accept is that the Minbari had in some way a change of heart. This is what you also said previously. For them, the war is not over. And if the shooting has stopped, this can only mean that they found a different, more subversive way to get their goal. Yeah. But there is definitely this belief that things are as they are. They fundamentally do not change. And so if somebody thinks things have changed, they must be confused. They must be under some sort of illusion or spell. And this is a repeating theme that we are going to see, especially with these kinds of characters in the show, because the big spoiler alert, these aren't the last people like this that are going to be on this station. So we definitely get this. Before we move on further into how this entire plot gets untangled later on, the little tidbits of truth that we get, I personally really like. Similarly to how the station is presented empty, and that's a very striking image. I feel like this is one of these examples where we get to see the Grey Council and the Minbari from the perspective of Earth during the Minbari War, which is very different. Like, by now we have seen Delenn in the Zen Garden, we've seen her very humanized, especially in the last episode we saw her interact with a close friend, we saw how intimate they can get, very much sympathetic. And now we see, especially in the delusion by the end, how Sinclair viewed them during the war, where they are just these grey hooded figures entirely without faces, entirely dehumanized, very alien and very, very scary. If you just have this image of them and then these like tall, towering, blue-black ships that can just slice and dice anything that humanity has, it gives you retroactively this sense of how threatening of a force they really could be if you do not have any of the context that we get.
Sometimes I find it sad that we, as viewers, never really only get this perspective, that we don't have this emotional experience where they are super scary. Because now we have to watch this episode and then maybe step back and realize, this is what Earth saw. They didn't even know what their faces looked like. They only had these ships, they had these hooded figures, and they knew that their planet could be wiped out within any moment. And that's a very strong experience. And what I had to think about actually, also sometimes from their masks and from how their voices worked, at least in the pilot, the Wraith in Stargate Atlantis, which Stargate is a super questionable show, but the Wraith, just how they are written, were one of the aliens that scared me the most when I was a child, and I find it so sad that they were not used better because they are so great. And just this horror of this space vampire with this somehow human but then also unhuman changed face, with these great ships and with this that suck life out of you and that shape civilization in this galaxy, this kind of horror the Minbari can have on you when you don't know them. And that I think, I think it was probably a conscious decision of the writer not to send the viewer through it, but it's definitely worth it take a step back and realize that's what it felt like as a human.
We should have an entire special episode comparing the Minbari to the Wraith, because there are so many parallels that are really interesting. We were talking just about the ships and the fact that both of them have these very biomechanical vessels in the same shades of blue and grey. And ultimately what the Wraith are in Stargate Atlantis are this unstoppable, much more advanced force that in periodic intervals is going to come to a planet and cull it. And there's nothing humans can do about this. And ultimately this is exactly what the Knights are afraid of. We have the Minbari. They have destroyed all of humanity's colonies, have reduced it to just a homeworld, and then just turn around and go away. And we don't understand why. So what's stopping them from just doing this every 15 years to prevent us from ever becoming a greater power?
I think if next week Meike is still not ready, we could make that discussion, because I really want to have that discussion, because I'm really not
That could
ready.
be an interesting special, right? So, yeah, there's definitely some thematic parallels where we can almost see like Stargate Atlantis as this what-if scenario if the Minbari hadn't calmed down, and we go through with this to the end. Because I think also on the other hand, the way that Sinclair is describing it, where, you know, this was the moment where humanity was going to get wiped out entirely, I think also that part is a little bit hyperbole. I personally don't think that humanity would have just died out in this instant. It's not impossible, but I feel like
it's almost impossible, to be honest, because whatever kind of strike you have on a planet, you always have like some broken rest civilization that survives somewhere.
I mean, the closest thing to a confirmation we get is much later on in All Alone in the Dark, when there is the Stripe, these aliens that kidnap pilots and have them fight each other in these little chambers. And in the end, Delenn gives us a little bit of context that, oh yeah, we Minbari, we know about this species. They tried this with us before, and we came and taught them a lesson. And this didn't turn them to extinction. It didn't even reduce them to a non-spacefaring civilization, but it clearly crippled them for a long time. And so I feel like this is probably what they had in store for humanity as well, where they probably would have bombarded some cities and made sure that our space industry was gone.
I think that's the most important thing. They probably would have wanted to keep us out of space.
Yeah.
For now, at least.
Which, once again, would also be an interesting allusion then back to the interwar period. So there's a lot of specials that we can get out of this episode alone. But okay, to move on.
Can we talk for a moment about the scenes where Sinclair is still in this cyberspace, but walking around the station, and they're completely psychotic? Because
okay, before we go there, there is a small moment which I really enjoy, is where we actually never get a verbal explanation of this, but we get to see how Sinclair breaks out of this. Because for all the security efforts that Garibaldi makes, ultimately Sinclair actually manages to get out of the situation on his own to some major degree. And this is where he starts figuring out that pain is real for both of them. And he starts flexing his hand in real life and in the simulation, sort of regaining a sense of his own reality, of his own body, which I think is just, as an image, very, very strong, that he's slowly peeling away the layers of this simulation and regaining control, agency in the real world, which sort of as a picture of how he sort of deals also with the illusion is very interesting. But of course, even as he breaks out of this, he stays in the delusion, and this is the part that you want to talk about.
yes, because that is kind of like the second thing that makes this episode so intense to watch for me, because it's just so... I find it very intense to watch him walking these corridors and being not completely there. So he's not locked into that machine anymore, but of course it has like messed with his brain chemistry a lot and everything. So he and people like approach him and trust him because he's the commander, but he's out there. I find that very, very terrifying, actually. That's like a second nightmare that I could talk about. So this episode really kind of triggers two of my nightmares that I've sometimes had, that you just walk down a place that you know, and you're just not in this world. You're just somewhere else in your mind.
Also, this complete inability for him to communicate any of what is actually happening to him.
And Can we talk about the actor a little bit who played Sinclair?
Of course.
Because he is sometimes giving me a lot of background information, and I think that he disappeared after the first season because of health problems, and this episode especially was terribly hard to act for him. Can you say more to that?
Yes. By this point, it's very hard. We would have to look at the production order to get a firmer grasp on when exactly this is happening, and it's also complicated by the fact that all of this information is only known by secondhand, very reliably so by JMS and such, but it was still the 90s, so
it's not publicly.
Let's take this all with a grain of salt. But it is known that he was having really bad psychological problems, to the point where he was having essentially everything that is described in this episode, down to the fact that he was having paranoid episodes, bad days as they called it, where he would get very paranoid about sort of getting this intense sense of being pursued and things like that, which was a big problem and something that we know the producer and JMS himself knew about, but the rest of the cast and crew also didn't, which complicated things because he had interactions with other members of the crew, and he had interactions with other members of the cast where he was out of it, and they were legitimately taken aback by how he was behaving, because it was just not appropriate and didn't have the context of also his mental health problems to really recognize that, which of course for him only made matters worse. And so it was very early on clear that for one, he needed somebody on set to sort of help communicate this, who was in the know. And it was a constant challenge for the production, of course.
Yes, and I find it so remarkable how he still acted through this episode. And it's just, I think it is so intense and it's so realistic because it is played by someone who knows this, who went through this on his own. So I feel like that was really acted out from a very deep point. That's probably why it always gets me, because it really always gets me. I have like goosebumps, and I feel I'm very scared of that episode each time, but it's done very well.
And if there's one thing that we can say with absolute certainty about Michael O'Hare, is that he had an absolute dedication to this job and to this role, to the point where he never wanted to give this role up. He never wanted to ask for a break from this, because he knew that the entire production was hanging on that, and if he did that, the show would likely be dead, which is part of why he struck also the special deal with JMS of keeping this under wraps until he died himself, just to make sure that the rest wouldn't be compromised with that, which obviously is something that he did at the risk of himself. And if you know that this level of dedication is behind that, you can imagine the dedication it also took to play an episode like this in this kind of state.
And that makes it even more sad that we didn't have more of him.
Absolutely.
I would have so loved to see him in the later part of the story, to be honest.
And especially knowing that he 100% would have been up for that if his health had allowed that. But very recently, like a lot of the other podcasts hit War Without End, where his big cameo is, and one of the big parts there is, even though he was able to do this special two-parter again, this was him at his absolute limit again. Like they knew in the production and also, okay, this is great that you can do this, but after that it was also very clear that, this is as much as we can possibly get. This is as much as he can possibly give. So it's great that we know that his story is going to end, and is going to end in a masterful way in this show, but now it's still obviously adds to the experience in the worst way, knowing that this is what stands behind it.
So, should we talk about how this all ends, how he is woken up, how it all unravels?
Yes, because then we start talking about Delenn a little bit, and maybe let's start with talking about Delenn as part of the Grey Council during the Minbari War. We are not going to go into spoilers very much there, because it's a bit early for that, but just what we can piece together. And then, how this puts her into this very interesting role that is not the last time that she's going to have this role as the savior by the end.
Yes, I mean, she approaches Sinclair very free of any fear, in a state where it's really not clear how he would react. I think we were all very worried because he is still out there.
Well, once again, it's this thing where it's almost like this little hinting at, hey, maybe if the Knights are right, if the Minbari really did program Sinclair in some way, she doesn't need to have any fear.
Yes, but my consent... Sorry for the chair noise.
Yes.
I'm moving back again, so sorry. My thought also was that there's either this possibility or that he is, by seeing her so badly triggered, that he just shoots her over. I think both could have happened.
And I think when it comes to the shooting, with her reaction to it, I don't think she looks like she was entirely certain what was going to happen there. Like, there's definitely this moment of doubt in there, and yeah.
But I also have to say that when we talk about Delenn, even when we see that other council member and the order that she has to die when he ever finds out, I never, even when I watched it for the first time and when I didn't know anything about the world building or anything about the Minbari, I never ever got the feeling that Delenn would actually execute such an order. No. I always get this sense of her that she genuinely cares, that she genuinely likes him and cares about humans and cares about general beings in the universe. And I never ever got to the point that I think, okay, she would do that. She's definitely having something dangerous in her mind. And I never had that feeling.
And I think this is a very important aspect there, because we learn in this episode Delenn was there on the ship leading the charge on Earth. And with everything that we know about Delenn, this doesn't make any sense. It's one of the many things that don't make any sense. But then we see this other member of the Grey Council, and that makes sense. Like, I see this guy that is like, if he knows anything about this secret, we will have to kill them. Yeah, that sounds like right about the kind of guy that would lead the charge on an attack like that during the Battle of the Line. So, okay, within the Grey Council, there's different camps, which makes sense. We know there's also religious Minbari, and there's warrior Minbari, and later on we'll learn there's also worker Minbari. So we don't have the pieces to put together what dynamics are at play there, but it kind of already paints this picture of, okay, even if she was a member of the Grey Council, it was probably not Delenn giving the orders at that point, which of course, knowing Delenn's full story is interesting to say the least. But at least in this situation, I feel like it's a bit odd that we have this council member in the closet in the end, just to give this a little line of exposition. But I think in terms of putting together what the Grey Council actually is and how it acts, it's important for, I think.
Yes.
Well, if you're talking about the resolution, let's also talk about the guy that gets shot, which I feel like he's the worst off. He's basically just taking care of the machinery the entire way through. He never goes into cyberspace with Sinclair. And so after his partner is knocked out, when Sinclair breaks out, he just, sort of the entire operation falls apart. He gets into this firefight with security. And honestly, I think it's a shame that one...
I'm sorry, I don't know why it happened.
It's a shame that one knight gets shot and the other one gets his mind wiped. Because honestly, where the episode is left by the end, when Sinclair has brought Delenn to the sickbay and has asked her this question, and she will never in a million years, give him the rest of this of the answer. It would have been so interesting to have one of the knights there, one of these conspiracy nuts, because now they are on the same page. Like, Sinclair could look at him and be like, okay, so there is something true to this. We have to get to the bottom of this, but also, I really don't want to work together with you guys. That could have been an interesting conflict of interest, I feel like. Because especially, I would have been very interested how somebody like Garibaldi would have reacted to that.
Yeah.
Because Garibaldi definitely would not be able to resist this mystery, but also is not very sympathetic to these guys. I think there's some interesting potential there.
Yeah, maybe I think here we noticed once more that we are in the 90s, because I always feel like using someone's own weapon against someone is like this old moral kind of thing that we see here in that story, because you use these cyber mind machine on someone else. You had to experience its full power.
Yeah. Which, I mean, the one of the last lines that he gets is, oh, maybe we are still in the simulation, which I don't think was ever intended to work very well as a bait for the viewers as, oh, maybe it was all a dream and the rest of the show is just in Sinclair said. I think it's more trying to evoke that the horror that we saw very evocative with Sinclair before is sort of what this guy is trapped in now. So sort of this
Yes,
emotional catharsis.
that's also how I saw it. It's like lost in a lucid dream.
Yeah. Which is, I think, just an evolving theme for Earth Alliance that doing this kind of stuff with minds, messing with people's minds through telepathy and through technology is something that humanity is just doing on a very large scale, and it adds a level of horror to this entire setting that we never really think about so much. But this is a world where you really are entirely transparent to the powers that be in some ways that is very uncomfortable. And once again, Meike has left us a very useful little tidbit here where there's actually an article on a trial in a newspaper where they also talk about downloading books directly into your brain. So this whole idea of messing with people's brains and like giving you a little chip to absorb an entire book collection and stuff, it's just something that humanity does now. And it is unsettling.
Yes. I mean, I've already said that in the last episode, no, in one of the last episodes when I was still here, when we recorded that, yeah, right, in that episode with Ironheart, that I find it interesting that the term clinically, what was that?
Crazy? Insane.
Clinically insane, that term is still used because we have so many versions of fabricated reality in here. Interesting here is that we definitely see a right-wing problem within humanity on Earth, but through the Psychor and through this meddling with minds and with what we see as reality, the show also gives space to the horrors on the other side. The show also gives space to horrors that happened, for example, under communist regimes, where reality is just constantly rewritten and reproduced just in whatever way you need it. Yeah. So both extremes of regimes are kind of get a mention here, which is nice that it doesn't only look on the one side, but on all the sides that were bad.
Yeah, I mean, this is also the point that we had early on, that this isn't just taking one historical example and painting it as sort of the metaphor for how all the worst things get. Now, this is really showing us sort of a perfect storm where all of this comes together. And, if we look at the Knights, the worst possible thing to happen when there's a conspiracy going around is if the official answer is even less believable or there's just not one given. And if the official stance of Earth Alliance is, well, we won the Minbari war because don't ask us this question and go away or we will rewrite your mind. And it makes sense that people start crafting their own theories about that. You can't really blame them about that. And yeah, it's sort of this self-perpetuating circle here where things just get worse because even the people that are trying to do the best, like Sinclair and such, are just running into these walls where there is something wrong, there is something not quite right with the world, and trying to break through that is crazy.
And I mean, it's also nice because whenever you live, there always is something not quite right with the world. You always have problems, you always have conflicts, and you always have political issues. Always have many layers, and there are always multiple interests colliding into each other. So you really never have this that you have someone with a white vest who really just fights for the people and you have a pure interest anywhere. It's always messy and complex, and it's still very important not to fall for the conspiracy theories out there. So at this point, I really like the show to say the truth can look very, very weird. Still doesn't mean that there's a base on the dark side of the moon or whatever,
And I mean, this is also what Sinclair embodies, where he takes on this question that he already had, but he continues pursuing it in a manner that is, not taking Delenn as she's in sickbay and starting to put narcotics in her to interrogate her further or something like that. You probably could do if you wanted to, but taking other measures. But if we are talking a bit about how scary this Babylon 5 universe is in this estimation, let's talk about somebody who probably believes he is this idealist with the white vest that is fighting for the good guys. It's our best friend Franklin, which I've learned in recent viewings is not the most liked character in the show.
Wait, Dr. Franklin?
Yes.
I haven't gotten to the point yet where I dislike him. No, I like him as a character, I have to say, but I have some points where I feel like, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah, that's I mean, to be fair, this is where most people land. Where he's an interesting character, but we learn a little bit about his backstory here more. He has a talk with Layla about his hitchhiking through the galaxy, which, apart from being a fun reference, is also just a very hopeful portrayal. And I think it's very notable for two reasons. For one, it gives us this sense that there was the conflict with the Minbari, but that was a crazy incident. That is not what humanity actually found when it went into space. For a while, humanity went into space and it had trade relations with a lot of different alien species, and you could go hitchhiking through the galaxy, literally going from ship to ship and just learning about the alien species, learning about the alien cultures, which is something that Dr. Franklin did, and seems like a really, really cool thing to be able to do. Just the fact that this isn't a universe where everybody is friendly and united, but it's also not a universe where everybody is constantly at war, where you can create these opportunities for yourself.
But I mean, it actually fits because you always have in the middle these hopeful episodes. Like we talked about so often lately, but we were little in a time where you could take a train from Berlin to Peking and you could drive through all of Russia with a train. And now when we are adults and we could do it, we are at war with Russia, basically. So, you always have these hopeful episodes in between. But another interaction with Dr. Franklin that was in this episode with Delenn was actually where she told her that he did not want his medical records to be used in the war, where he destroyed his work so that it could not be used. And I find that a very, very nice conversation, actually. Not because Franklin could really portray him there as this White West kind of person, but because we have these two people that 10 years ago were on different sides on a very dramatic war. Mm-hmm. But they talk even about the time afterwards, and although they were enemies, they had shared beliefs and morals and find together, which is wonderful, I think. And
yes.
Nicely written.
And it's also wonderful that we see that this common ground is something important enough that they also accept the fact that Delenn is not giving an answer, and he turns the question back around. He asks her, what did you do during the war? And she just says, that's a story for another time.
Yeah, but
and he leaves it be at that.
Because I think he also realizes that means, the story is very long. We have to talk about that.
Very long, probably complicated, probably more difficult than would be appropriate at that point. And now he's one of the people that actually can deal with that realization, whereas probably our knights would go absolutely nuts over that. But yeah, it's a thing, and I also find that instance what he talks about interesting because we've talked before about how Earth Alliance seems to have this tendency to grapple at all alien knowledge and technology, collecting the organic technology from infection and stuff like that. And now obviously you can ask the question, is this something that Earth Alliance always did? Or is it really like Franklin says that in the face of the Minbari War, they were so afraid of possible extinction or at least massive damage that at that point, for the first time, they sort of grabbed in as desperation for this idea, give us all the medical records. If worse comes to worse, we'll try biological warfare on them. And is this maybe something that during this war was normalized and then they never stopped? They just said, okay, if this is a possibility of something that can happen, we just need to be prepared. We will have to invest in all the crazy weapons projects because we can't have something like the Minbari War happen ever again.
Yes, but also this always kind of plays with this possibility of we could need that sometime, so let's just build this monstrous thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about a big crazy incident and then the government starts collecting data like crazy, you can also make a 9/11 reference there, which isn't even something that has happened during the show, but in retrospect feels very appropriate.
Yes, or what I also had to think about was when I was in Hungary, I watched a very classic Hungarian movie that was shot in the 60s and was forbidden during communism. the witness, if someone wants to look into it. Or we also had a character who was a party member who constantly had to fabricate a new kind of reality that his leaders would swallow. Like he at some point even selling a lemon as an orange just so that there was a Hungarian orange. And you see him constantly really having like a crazy look at some point when reality just slips away from him. He constantly checks down pills. You don't know what it's for. It could be his kidneys that's kind of crazy, or it could be something else. And his catchphrase was always, what was it? International relations are intensifying, and then he has to fabricate a new kind of reality. And that kind of reminds me of, like, on this level, really, what is actually a threat, what is actually needed, what is actually real is constantly being rewritten.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, we talk about how interesting it is that these people who were on enemy sides 10 years ago are now on friendly terms, which on this personal level is great. For the Earth government, it's absolutely crazy. This is not good. This is just one more variable that they cannot control. And once again, it's also in this weird position where obviously the way that Earth Alliance goes about it is not great, but on the other hand, it is somewhat relatable given the sort of history that they have in this universe. So,
and at least it's not written as dumb, if I'm allowed to say that, as it sometimes looks like in the novel 1984, which people like to cite so often lately with fake news and everything. And I think the novel is interesting and worth to be read and discussed, definitely. But just this point that every 3 years that you have like three fractions on Earth, and every 3 years you can change who is at war with whom and can pretend it has always been like this and everyone swallows it and it is stable for decades. It's just, it won't work. You could have this attempt, you could have interesting regimes with it, but that would just not work.
I think this is also like just this point where Babylon 5 as a show is trying to tell a very different story, has a very different plot around it. Yeah, and that's good. It's once again, it's not only doing more with the historical reference than just reciting it, it's doing the same also when it comes to literary references, where 1984 clearly has a lot of very obvious inspiration lent to this, especially when we read mini packs later on, which is just verbatim. But clearly it's also an attempt to use this material and interpret it in a new way and do something new and interesting with it. So,
but we are actually now kind of looking at ourselves and other references. But actually, I find it great that in this episode where we had this only one plot, this very straightforward plot of this cyber attack on Sinclair, we talked about so many different things because we had to question reality over and over again, which just shows how great this is written.
Absolutely. I mean, it is just one plot, but it sort of encompasses everything that will come after this point. And obviously, we are not going to give Meike the full spoiler treatment of what all of this means. But of course, like we say, even if she isn't in this episode, she watches alongside with us. And by the time she rejoins, we'll make sure that she has also the, just in mind how much of what was seen here actually is not just set dressing, but will come in later on. With this, I think let's talk a little bit about greater connections, maybe.
The tapestry.
Then let's talk about the tapestry a little bit. As usual, we want to take a look at all the things that make Babylon 5 whole. The one big theme is, of course, the story, but there's also character developments, themes that are recurring, little threads that are picked up again, and we always want to make sure that we weave them together and showcase all the different connections that these episodes have. With this one, we've already talked about a lot of the connections, obviously everything that pertains to Sinclair and the hole in his mind, everything that pertains to the Minbari War, and the Earth election and all that has brought about with the different factions that we are now slowly getting to see what this support for Santiago actually means, where it comes from, and what people maybe are hoping for in that. Anything else that we picked up in this episode that is maybe from previous ones that comes to mind?
No, I don't think so.
No. Okay, then let's talk a little bit about hopes or things that might happen in the future. Obviously, without Meike, we can't speculate as well as a first comer can. But just broadly speaking, what are some of the things that would be interesting to follow up on, or maybe to keep an eye on in following episodes? Because even if we know them in broad terms, maybe there are some subtle aspects that we don't know yet.
Yes, I mean, definitely all the questions about Sinclair and the Minbari. We definitely now I think get the idea that we have to watch Dylan. We have to know what are her orders and how is she going to execute them or not. I think that's very interesting. And of course, we want to see how the mystery unravels. Yes.
I think what you mentioned there, how will she follow these orders or not, is very interesting, because a main difference between conspiracy theories and reality is always that conspiracy theory assumes there is a master plan. There's one big entity, Illuminati or somebody else, who has it all figured out and is manipulating things to their end. And the reality often is, no, things are just much more complicated and chaotic like that. Like, there isn't really the government that does stuff. The government is made up of people and groups that all have their own interests, and sometimes those align to a point where it does get something done, but it's very rarely something that you can say, for the past 10 years they have been relentlessly working at this one plan that has been unchanging. And this is very much what we see in this episode. In the minds of the Knights, the Minbari are this monolithic entity that came to attack Earth and has some big plan. And the one thing that we get confirmation on is here that, no, there's 2 members of the Grey Council that we see, and they don't agree on anything. Yeah. And so it's going to be interesting. We know the story, the reality of how the Minbari war ended is as crazy as the conspiracy theory. And it's probably going to be crazier, because it's not going to be a big master plan. It's going to be a connection of different decisions that were made in the moment that aren't planned ahead as much as they probably thought.
But I think what we see here also is that we are in a world and in a situation where we basically could ask any person that we meet, hey, what have you done 10 years ago? So, and I mean, that's kind of complicated, but, we get a glimpse on how Franklin behaved during the war. We have the question of what has Dylan done during the war. So I think a pattern that maybe opened up here is that we are interested in the backstories of our characters. Where were they in this big mess?
Yes.
That is a connection to previous episodes and to future episodes that we see here.
And one perspective that I would really like to look out for, because I know it's not going to be the big focus, but I'm not entirely sure how many little character dialogue snippets we maybe get, is what was Garibaldi doing in this war?
Yes.
Because in his big talk with Sinclair, we know he wasn't at the Battle of the Line, but he was part of Earth Force. And that is a very interesting perspective to be in, because so far we've gotten the perspective of people that were helpless on the planet, just watching on, and we had people that were in the actual Battle of the Line. But what about somebody who is serving, but didn't get to take part in this big decisive battle? How did that happen? And what does this do to the psyche of somebody? Because now you have somebody who could do something, you could help out, and just isn't in the position to do so. And we know that it had some bad consequences for Garibaldi, because he also fell off the wagon more than once. So there is definitely the perspective to dig into.
Yes. And yes, I think those are the big connecting points, actually. Another thing that I always wonder about, and that's actually why it's so cool that Meike left us her notes, because I have never looked at the headlines, to be honest. I find it interesting that we still have a jurisdiction on Earth that still works against Home Guard and fellow groups. At the end of this episode and of another episode where we also have a big terror group on the station, I always wonder, if we arrest them and we send them home back to Earth, are they even going to be prosecuted in the correct way? And at this point, we also have to ask ourselves, how long are they going to be? And even if we get them sentenced now, how long until all of these sentences are going to be revoked?
It's this, but it could also be an indicator of how much infighting is there. Because I can totally buy, if I have these 2 knights and there is a bigger organization behind them, they would have no problem convicting a Home Guard leader. Because if Home Guard starts going around doing mass assassinations of Minbari and ambassadors, that just messes up everything. And that is a very crude and a very simple way to deal with this. That is not useful to an organization that is maybe just as nefarious, but has more complicated goals.
Yes.
So this is also one of these things where, you wonder, they get convicted, but for what reason? Legitimately because they did break the law, or maybe they are just not the right flavor of conspiracy at this point.
Yes, but what I was also thinking about was that interwar period reference again, but I'm confused at the moment. Who was the Rathenau was the social democrat who was murdered in the early 20s, right?
That we would have to look up.
Yes, I think so. Or at least it's actually not so important who it was. My main point is that you had all of these assassinations and you had really serious political motivated crimes and murders in the interwar period in Germany, for example, and you had you caught the person who did it, and they were sentenced to life sometimes, and then a few years later were freed by the Nazis because regime changed. And that was what I was thinking about when I see all of these people that we catch the evil ones, we arrest them, we send them to Earth, and how long are they going to be held there until the system changes?
Especially when we talk about, like we did a little bit, how many of the patterns of how they operate we see now that will be reflected in the regime later on. So we definitely know, some people that were in organizations like these tonight definitely get jobs later on in the interrogation camps and such, which is very important because the more we go into this Earth regime that is going to be built, and the same is true with the real-life Nazi regime, you get all of these people in very important positions now, and you kind of got to wonder, where do these come from? Like, how do you have somebody that has the skill set to run something like the propaganda department or mini packs or something like that? And I think this is just something that Babylon 5 is also very successful in portraying, is that these are problems that exist in a society, and these are people that exist in a society, and it's not that they suddenly appear and then the society crumbles. No, even Earth Alliance at this point is a robust system that has measures in place to deal with these kinds of things, that has a judicial branch that's actually enforcing the laws, that makes sure that kidnapping doesn't usually happen, and that politically motivated murder is frowned upon. Of course, these systems do fail, but it's not because nothing happens there. And especially if you look at something like the interwar period, I think part of the narrative that sometimes we get, at least in my specific land and the kind of education that I got, there was a little bit of this sense that, the reason that the Nazi Party came about is because the Weimar Republic was just broken to a point where it just needed to be fixed. And then there is obviously this implication, now that we've fixed the nation, it can't go wrong anymore, which is obviously a very simplified way of looking at it. And that isn't to say that a state like the Earth Alliance or the Weimar Republic didn't have obvious flaws that needed fixing, very clearly so, but that is also not the entirety of the story, and it's not the end of the story. And so it prevents you from putting the blame on something as simple as that very easily. And the same with here, we can't say, oh, Earth is just this cesspool of bad people and nobody ever tries to do anything right there. No, there is a lot of people, and especially as we go further on in the show, it's going to become very clear. The reason that we follow Babylon 5 is because Babylon 5 as a place is special. But it's not like the people on Babylon 5 are just the best humans around and nobody else is going to try and form a resistance. No, other places are going to do that. And if and when they fail, it's going to be for very concrete reasons, not because the people aren't good enough, not because we have to follow a bunch of heroes of the story that are better than anybody else. And this is something I think we're going to be very appreciative of.
Yes.
Okay, outro time.
Outro. So this was our discussion of a, for me personally, always very scary episode.
Yes.
Next week, probably also the two of us are going to do an episode.
Yeah, well, the problem is that Meike currently is lost in hyperspace, which is very unpredictable when and how she is going to have time again.
I just wanted to say that the next regular episode we are going to discuss would be Deathwalker,
yes,
which might not be what we are recording next. We could do a little special discussion if Meike is still lost.
Yes.
We haven't decided that yet, but we are definitely going to do a next one soon.
There's definitely going to be something on our usual date, and this time, even if we do a special discussion, it's going to be something meatier than just the gameplay showcase that we had last week, even though this is also something that we might carry on in some fashion. So you definitely have something to look forward. And if people have something to look forward to, where can they find us?
They can find us on YouTube, on Twitter, as long as it still exists. I will work on a Mastodon account very soon because I don't have trust in Twitter at all anymore. You can also find us on Instagram and on Facebook, where we have our own group. We are the Third Age podcast everywhere. And we also have to catch up on a few things. We have to start a few polls that we have mentioned in the last. So we will regularly start polls. You can vote, and you can please also write a comment with your opinion. Even if it takes us a few weeks, we will always pick it up and talk about it at some point.
Yes, which is also maybe a special at this point that we're going to do at some point. But the responses to the polls so far have been really, really great. It's always very interesting. That's something that we keep in mind because especially if something like which kind of empire are the Centauri like. Once we've seen this poll, we will precisely answer to that, but it will also be just something that we know as we keep discussing these factions, these characters and such. Of course, it will guide just where our mind is at.
Yes. So please visit our channels and like and share if you are very proud of us today.
Yes, you can also always subscribe and ring the bell icon if you want to get regular updates on anything that we do. And yeah, we are very excited to see you next time. Hopefully, keep your fingers crossed with Meike again, and maybe a special, maybe not.